Okay, let's see.
I like the company so far.
Wonderful. Okay, let's see. And we are just 1 minute away from letting folks in, and we'll begin. Okay, let's see. Oops, that's the wrong one. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, I will let folks in. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Ignatian Year lecture this evening, and we are excited to have you with us. And we want to be able to mention a few things about Campion College, our host, as well as campus ministry and the Jesuit Center for Catholic Studies at Campion. So to begin, my name is Kelly Burke and I coordinate campus ministry at Campion College, a service and ministry offered to all students, staff, and faculty at the University of Regina. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Ignatian Year Lecture from Campion College here on Zoom. Campion was established in 1917. Campion College was named for the Jesuit priest and scholar, Saint Edmund Campion, whose feast we celebrated yesterday. Through a special act of the legislature of the province of Saskatchewan, it was officially founded as the Catholic College of Regina. In 1964, the college was granted federation with the University of Saskatchewan, Regina campus, later to become the University of Regina. Today, Campion College boasts a faculty complement of 20+ full-time professors offering courses in the areas such as astronomy, Catholic studies, classics, English, film studies, history, mathematics, political science, psychology, religious studies, and statistics. Campion College is one of over 190 Jesuit post-secondary institutions worldwide, and the only Jesuit undergraduate college in Canada. Our goal is to provide a liberal arts education that is dedicated to the development of the whole person, intellectually, personally, socially, for service within society. And the Ignatian Year, which Father Sammy will mention as well, is a special year celebration that began in May and continues until July 2022. And it is the 500-year celebration that marks the conversion of Saint Ignatius. And so in our Ignatian institution, the things that we celebrate and work on and try to emulate, recognizing that we are celebrating that 500th year. And so it helps us to reflect in many ways about how we experience little and big conversions in our own life. And Father Scott will be speaking a little bit more about that. So with no further ado, I am going to turn to Father Sammy Halawa, who will introduce Father Scott and the topic of our Ignatian Year lecture.
That would be me. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's special lecture, The Life and Relevancy of St. Ignatius of Loyola in History and in Our Current Times, to be delivered by Father and Dr. Scott Lewis, S.J. Father Lewis is a Jesuit from the United States, originally from Hawaii. After finishing high school studies, Father Scott joined the U.S. Navy and stayed there for about 10 years. His education background is rather extensive in history, in theology, and biblical studies. He has his doctoral studies in St. Paul's epistles and theology from the Gregorian University in Rome. After he finished his studies in Rome, he worked for a short period in Jerusalem before he joined the faculty ranks at Regis College, a member of the Toronto School of Theology at the University of Toronto. He taught for 25 years at Regis College and won the admiration of many of his students. I was one of them, and look where it took me. In addition to his scholarly work, Father Lewis is often sought after for spiritual retreats and workshops for the diocesan clergy and for religious and lay communities. On July 1st, 2021, he joined Campion College, a federated university college to the University of Regina, as a professor lecturer in Catholic studies. This winter, 2022, he will be offering 2 courses in Catholic studies. One is under the title, The Church, the Bible, and Violence. And the second course will be Spirituality and Christian Life in Early Catholicism. I strongly recommend that you take a course or 2 of his this winter. And the registration is currently open at Campion College or University of Regina. Dr. Lewis' talk this evening is part of the Ignatian year, commemorating 500 years anniversary of the conversion of St. Ignatius of Loyola, which Campion College is currently involved through its campus ministry. Without further delay, please join me to welcome our guest speaker, Father and Dr. Scott Lewis.
Thank you, Father Sammy. I'll go ahead and put our, I need to be given permission to share. No?
It should be on now.
Okay, got it now. Okay. These are the little glitches that make things interesting. Okay. A few years ago, a friend of mine, a Jesuit friend of mine, went to Spain to study for his philosophical studies. And I asked him to bring back for me some kind of memento of St. Ignatius, a picture, a medal, something like that. And he said he would. And when he came back, he said, "You don't know what I had to go through to get that. That it's very odd. That's where St. Ignatius was from. And he is so well known. And yet there is not a great and fervent devotion to him in the same way that many people would be devoted to St. Francis or St. Benedict or someone like that. Because in a sense, Ignatius of Loyola is an enigma. Even while he was still living, the myth makers were already at work. And they were at work crafting an image of the man to suit the needs of the time and the needs of various interests. And the biggest interest and need of the time was that he was going to be crafted as the Counter-Reformation warrior. That was one such image. And in the minds of many, the Society of Jesus was founded to combat Protestantism. And we still find that in the minds of many people. And this same view holds that the Jesuits had a slavish devotion to the papacy and were in effect papal shock troops whose calling was to engage in warfare with Luther and his followers. Well, there's no denying that that's what the society became later, but that is not really what Ignatius was about at the beginning, not during his lifetime. The education was believed to be its chief apostolate from the very beginning, but actually none of these statements is entirely true. The work of the first Jesuits consisted of giving the spiritual exercises, preaching, hearing confessions, and education came later and only at the request of local rulers. And Ignatius himself was not combative or bellicose in his dealings with Protestants, and he always preferred dialogue and charity. And although always showing respect and obedience to the papacy, Ignatius explicitly stated that he did not want his men to be known as papists. He clashed with Pope Paul IV, who threatened the very existence of the society. And this individual who was looked upon as the paragon of orthodoxy was jailed twice by the Inquisition and was constantly under observation and investigation for his entire life. Some interesting observations on his life. For 15 years after his conversion, he engaged in an active and vibrant ministry as a layman, preaching and giving the spiritual counsel. And he showed no inclination towards ordination as a priest. And in this sense, he might have followed the founders of two other orders, St. Francis and St. Benedict, neither of whom was a priest. It was only after he was arrested at one particular point in question that he was told that he could no longer teach and no longer give spiritual counsel unless he studied theology and was ordained. But even after ordination, he waited a full year before celebrating his first Mass. Unfortunately, we don't have many sources from the earlier stages of his life. And the so-called autobiography dictated to his secretary a few years before his death is most of what we have. And it shows evidence of, in itself, being heavily redacted. Written in the third person, he refers to himself only as the pilgrim. And that is a good image for his life. He was always on the move, and he was always looking for new horizons. The title for this talk, Man of His Time, Man for Our Times, was chosen to highlight his unique time and place in history. It was the end of the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages were going out with a whimper or waning, and the transition to the early modern period, the Renaissance, had already begun and flourished and had begun to fade. And moving into the period of the Counter-Reformation, it was a period of, well, we say, combativeness and intolerance. The story of Ignatius really is the story of the journey of a soul. The formation of a flawed man, and a very flawed man, into a saint through life experiences and God's grace. And often events in our lives intervene that set us on a completely different direction and calling from the one that we had planned. His experiences became the catalyst for his spirituality and the spiritual exercises, and eventually for the Society of Jesus itself. A little bit about his background. He was born in 1491 in Basque Country, northern Spain. And he's born to a noble Basque family, the youngest of 13 children. Aspizia is nearby a place called Loyola, and his name was originally Inigo Lopez de Loyola. And Ignatius became his name later in honor of Ignatius of Antioch. He grew up as a page in the household of the royal treasurer of Castile, Juan Velázquez de Cuellar. And during this period, there was little to recommend him as a saint, as with the lives of so many saints. He was described by one historian, Robert Cohen, as, quote, a youthful courtier, a swaggering caballero, and a soldier in the service of the Spanish king. Another scholar describes him as, in the following way: a fancy dresser, an expert dancer, a womanizer, sensitive to insult, and a rough, punkish swordsman who used his privileged status to escape prosecution for violent crimes committed with his priest brother at carnival time. There's a story, an apocryphal story, told about a bunch of Jesuit vocation directors who were having a meeting. And one of them asked for their analysis, their advice on a particular applicant to the society. And he described him as a man already at the edge of middle age, poorly educated. He was arrogant and proud. He had a physical handicap. He had a police record. And there was even rumors that he had fathered children out of wedlock. And so the question was, should we admit this man to the society? And of course, there were horrified gasps. No, send him away. He'd be nothing but trouble. And the answer was, well, you've just turned down Ignatius of Loyola, because that is what he was. And so his background then follows the tracks of many saints. It was a very curved track, a very crooked one. He served in the military for the Duke of Najera, the Viceroy of Navarre. The French were invading to retake the area, and there was a war between Francis I of France and Charles V of the Holy Roman Emperor. And Ignatius and his troops were surrounded in Pamplona. Most wanted to surrender, but not Ignatius. He refused and convinced them to fight on. And it's at this point that the autobiography begins to describe the beginning of his new life. This is a little bit about the official saint. This is the one that is in the minds of most people. It's all glory and it's all hallelujah. And he is clearly headed to heaven. He's being pulled up, beamed up there out of the earth. And this is from a Baroque church in Rome. This is where he was born. And this is Loyola, Aspizia in Basque Country. It's a very beautiful place. And this is a depiction of him as the young caballero. He certainly looks different from the way the saint is depicted. He looks like he's ready to fight. And at this particular point, this is where his life takes a very dramatic turn. It's said many times, it's a cliche, but cliches are usually true, that your life can change in an instant. And in this case, it was a cannonball that shattered his leg. And it shattered his leg in his career. And since he was a nobleman, the French treated him well. And they took him to his home to convalesce. And there were several operations to reset his leg. And it didn't take very well. The bone grew in crookedly. And since it was improperly set, so he had it rebroken. We can imagine what pain that was without anesthesia. But to all accounts, he bore it very stoically. And even then, it grew out crooked. And out of vanity, because he liked to show off his legs, he asked that the flesh and the bone be cut away. And again, he bore this very stoically. But one leg was shorter for the rest of his life, and he had a limp to go with it. This is a brass plaque. And when I visited Pamplona, the guide we were with, we walked along where the walls of the city used to be. And he said, this is the place where Ignatius of Loyola, where his leg was shattered by the cannonball. And I asked the question, I said, how do we know that this is the place? And he looked at me as if I had two heads and said, well, because there's a bronze plaque here. And so that's a circular argument if I ever heard it. But this is the place where it's commemorated today. The walls are no longer there, but there are the outlines of where the walls used to be. So during this recovery, it was a long and painful recovery. He asked for reading material, and he wanted fluff. He was somewhat of a romantic. He wanted entertainment reading. And he had a very active imagination, and he liked to fantasize about accomplishing great deeds, serving kings and doing deeds out of devotion to an unattainable great lady. He's definitely a man of the late Middle Ages in this sense. And that there's a chivalrous mentality revealed in the many ways that he was still living with one foot in the Middle Ages, but he was about to be yanked out of those Middle Ages. They didn't have the fluff that he wanted so badly. All they had were The Life of Christ by Rudolph of Saxony and The Golden Legend, a collection of lives of the saints by Jacopo di Voragine. Standard but influential fare for spiritual reading, and we can almost see him groan inwardly and roll his eyes as he was given these to read. So there'd be nothing else to do. He did read them. And he noticed that when he fantasized about doing great deeds for kings and ladies, they were exciting, but they left him empty and restless. When he did the same about great deeds of renunciation and holiness like the saints, he was left with a feeling of contentment and peace. And reading these two books and And meditating on that experience, how one fed his soul and the other did not, laid the groundwork for the recognition of the two spirits and their characteristics of consolation and desolation. And of course, these are fundamental to the practice of discernment that is put in the rather probably unfortunate terms as the good spirit and the evil spirit. He finally decided to do great deeds out of love for God and the saints, with little understanding of what that was going to entail. So in 1522, he decided to go to Jerusalem as a pilgrim and a penitent, and he had a vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary that confirmed him in his decision. And over the objections of his family and the Duke, he started out for Montserrat. And he said that being instructed by God at this point, and his eyes open, but he was still at the beginning stages of his journey. And as he's heading towards Montserrat, he had an incident along the way. He was riding alongside of Moor, a Muslim, and they were, for a while, they discussed the Virgin Mary. And the Moor believed in the virgin birth of Jesus, but he also believed that afterwards Mary lived a normal married life. And after the Moor left, Ignatius worked himself into a real rage, believing that the Moor had dissed the mother of Jesus, and he wanted to kill it. So he decided to give the reins to his donkey. If the donkey took the road to the village, he would seek out the Moor and kill it. If it remained on the road, he would let him be. As twisted as this seems, it was a rudimentary form of discernment. He was reluctant to act on his immediate impulses. Fortunately for the Moor, the donkey made the right choice. Montserrat is a place up maybe about an hour from Barcelona, with a fantastic view. It's up high on the mountains. And in this church there at Montserrat, the Benedictine monastery, is the Black Madonna. And there's where it is today. And at this point, he gave over his sword and his dagger. He gave over his sword and dagger at the altar of the Black Madonna. And he made a confession, a general confession, which took 3 days. And the priest who was his confessor introduced him to a manual of spiritual exercises by Garcia Jimenez de Cisneros, who was a late medieval writer. And in this formed the basis of the spiritual exercises later. Contrary to popular belief, and I've had people actually say this to me, the spiritual exercises were not dictated by the Virgin Mary to Ignatius. They were very much a work that came down through generations. So after giving his sword and dagger at the altar of the Black Madonna, he set off on the journey, and he exchanged his fancy clothes with a beggar, and he began his journey. And after a while, they caught up with him on the road, and apparently the poor beggar had been arrested by the police. They saw him in fine clothes, and they accused him of stealing the clothes. And Ignatius was in tears when he saw what trouble he had caused the man. And so he decided to take a little detour and go to a place called Manresa. We'll get there in just a moment. This is a picture of the Sword of Ignatius, which is in Barcelona. And it's a nice sword indeed. And it has a long history, and which I won't go into here. But he decided to go to Manresa, and he was going to stay there a very short time. And he wound up staying there for quite some time, for almost a year. And he lived in a cave at Manresa. And if you notice, most of the spiritual centers, the retreat centers of the Society of Jesus, are named Manresa around the world, and including the one in the Canadian province in Pickering. And he refused food and drink at most times. And he gradually became, well, he had a mental breakdown is what it amounts to. He was filled with self-loathing and scruples. He had thoughts of suicide. He was going to hurl himself out of a window at one point. It was a period of intense asceticism. and he did not cut his hair. He did not cut his nails. He was filthy. At this particular point, he would go to confessors to confess his sins again and again and again. And his confessors said, knock it off. No more. Don't confess those sins again. But he still had thoughts of suicide. At this particular point, he was a psychological wreck. And he was consoled by a vision of a serpent, like a thing with many eyes. And he said it was beautiful and consoling. But later on, he determined that it was an evil source and kind of dismissed it. But he deepened that understanding of the two spirits, that we really are, we have light and darkness within us. We have positive and negative. And the two kind of intertwine. And there's great wisdom in learning how to read the movements of those two spirits and to be able to discern what they are trying to teach us. At this point, many came to him for consolation and advice, and he saw the fruit of the Spirit in this, and he was consoled, and he began to recover. And by the way, he was fed by pious women at this particular point. They used to bring in food and care for him, and not knowing that they were caring for a future saint. He had many visions of Christ and the Virgin Mary at this point, and a vision of the Trinity, which is depicted in the stained glass window at Pickering, when he was trying to understand the Trinity, that it was three keys playing in harmony, and gave him great consolation and a great devotion to the Trinity. And he looked upon this period as one of being a student with God as the schoolmaster. He also had a vision at the River Cardener, and this is the cave at Manresa. And of course, it doesn't look much like a cave now because they built a huge basilica over the top of the thing. All that stuff wasn't there when Ignatius was there. But you can visit it today. This is the river where he was sitting one day, and it's not exactly a vision that he had, many prophets and mystics of all religions have revelations near bodies of flowing water. And we can even think of Ezekiel in the Old Testament near the river there in Babylon. It didn't say that he had a vision. It said his eyes of understanding were opened. And there's a difference there. And he understood and knew many spiritual things and matters of faith and learning. It's very interesting that for most of his life, his instruction did not come from books. He jumped through the hoops because he had to. But most of his spiritual instruction came through internal personal revelation. And he said, so great an enlightenment that everything seemed new to him. And he says this was such that the whole course of his life, through 62 years, even if he gathered up the many helps he had from God and all the things he knew and added them together, he does not think that they would amount to as much as he had received at that one time. And so this gave him a huge consolation. And it was also the last appearance of that weird serpent that seemed to kind of float around that he would see in the air around him. Just a side note, the great psychologist Carl Gustav Jung was fascinated by the spiritual exercises, including the visions of Ignatius. And he kind of dismissed the other revelations and visions that were more theological in nature. He said, well, that's kind of governed by his beliefs. But this one he felt was not evil, but archetypal. And so there were many different ways that we could interpret this. And at this particular point, the serpent vision finally made its last appearance. During this period, he had several illnesses and he was close to death many times. And he traveled to Venice to depart for Jerusalem, sleeping in fields and doorways. And he begged for the fare to Jerusalem. And he's a strange character. He would beg for money to travel to Jerusalem. And then when the money was given to him, he would give it away. Or he would leave behind the few coins he had so he could rely completely on God. He seemed to be almost afraid to accept any kind of support. And he was introduced to the Doge of Venice and given passage on a diplomatic ship headed for the Holy Land. And he almost didn't make it to the Holy Land because he was really a pain in the neck. The man who was the swaggering, cursing individual who was arrested by the police for abominable crimes and so on, was offended by the swearing and blasphemies of the sailors. And he was so, shall we say, self-righteous during this journey that the crew planned to abandon him on an island. Fortunately, they didn't. And in 1523, he arrived in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem at this time was held by the Turks. It had been conquered by Suleiman the Magnificent. And so the Franciscans were the ones who were kind of in charge of the holy places in the Holy Land. And as he arrived in Jerusalem, he was conducted to the holy sites by the Franciscan guides. And going to the holy sites was influential in forming his, in the spiritual exercises, his practice of composing the place. That is, looking at the passage from Scripture and imagining what it looked like and placing oneself in it. And he wanted to stay. He says, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here. And the custos, the Franciscan in charge of the contingent of the Holy Land, said, no, you're not. And you're going to leave. And furthermore, if you don't leave, I have the power to excommunicate you. And so Ignatius reluctantly left. And I've often wondered what would have happened if he had not. And I like to remind Franciscan friends of that if the custos had not thrown him out, that we wouldn't exist. That always gets a good laugh. As he was leaving, was going back one more time to the Mount of Olives. And it's interesting that the Mount of Olives, there is a place there where Jesus was supposed to have ascended into heaven. And there's a little indentation in the rock. And he wanted to, and that's supposedly where Jesus kind of pushed off to head for heaven. And as he approached, of course, there's a Turkish guard there, and the guard wouldn't let him in. So he took his last possession, which was a little penknife, and he bribed the guard. He wanted to look and see which direction the foot was pointing when Jesus ascended to heaven. So his experience of the places and his experience of Scripture was very sensate, down to imagining the pattern and the clothing and which direction the foot was pointing and so on. And that it's also interesting that on that very Mount of Olives and so forth, there's a place where Muhammad's horse also left an indentation. I guess the stones are rather soft there. It seems that everybody leaves their footprints. And he made an arduous journey back to Spain. He was at sea a month, nearly shipwrecked. He was cold and miserable. He passed between two armies because there were many wars that were going on at this particular point. The armies were Spanish and French. And he was taken in for questioning and accused of being a spy and later released as a bad man. So I don't know what kind of consolation that would be. No, you're not a spy. You're just crazy. That's all. And at this point, he began his education. And he had to go back to school at middle age. And I love this picture. He's at a desk that's far too small for him. The boys who are with him there look absolutely bored. And a very stern instructor is staring down at him. And we can only imagine what might have been going through his mind at this particular point. So he had to study Latin. He went to the University of Salamanca in 1526, and then the University of Alcalá in 1527. And he had distractions in class. You know, nowadays students are distracted by their iPhones, but he was distracted by visions and consolations and revelations that he would receive during class. And the things he was supposed to be mastering and memorizing just kind of faded into the background. So he had to will himself to focus on his studies. And he had to push the other into the background. Just think, having to push mystical experiences into the background so that you could conduct your studies. And even while studying, he continued to give the spiritual exercises to others. He was always obsessed by one particular thought, the good of souls. And at Salamanca and Alcalá, he fell under suspicion by the Inquisition. He was suspected of being an alumbrado. And an alumbrado was not a good thing to be in 16th century Spain. It meant the illuminated ones, and they were lay groups, not clerical groups. They met in homes. They claimed kind of inward religious experience and private revelations and so forth. And they were distrusted, and they were looked upon as subversive by the Inquisition. And so he was the victim of many rumors, and he was investigated and cleared, but he was ordered to dye his clothes black and wear shoes, since he didn't belong to a religious order. He couldn't wear sandals or anything like that. He had to wear shoes. He got in further trouble because many of the individuals with whom he associated and gave the spiritual exercises to were women. And some of them embarked on pilgrimages of their own or would visit him often. And of course, the rumor mills started going. And so he was under constant suspicion for that. And there's still this alumbrado accusation hung over his head because they were at the fringes of the institutional church. He spent 42 days in jail, and he refused offers to pull strings or buy him out. He said, "No, that's not the way I do things. I'm going to trust in God." When he was released, they were ordered to dress as students and not to speak of matters of faith until they had studied 4 more years, for they were unlearned. They didn't have their MDivs. And at this point, he's dictating his autobiography as the individual who was working for the Inquisition was giving him this order. He adds in the third person, because he always spoke in the third person and spoke of himself as the pilgrim. He said, "In truth, the pilgrim was the one who knew the most, though his learning had little foundation." In other words, he didn't suffer from a lack of self-confidence. He knew he was right, but he knew that there was no way that he could convince others of that, because his particular instruction came from another source. But he found this all very upsetting, and he proceeded to Salamanca. He was given the 3rd degree there by the Dominicans and imprisoned again. And after examination, he was released, but forbidden to talk about venial and mortal sins, the difference between the two. Ignatius was outraged, for he felt his mouth had been shut and that he could no longer help souls. So he decided to study theology and went to the University of Paris. He went alone and on foot. And we can imagine what that's like. That's hundreds and hundreds of miles. And he's alone and on foot and had no money. And as he entered the University of Paris, it was a place and time of great intellectual and spiritual ferment. The Counter-Reformation and the Reformation were battling it out. It was also a center of Christian humanism. And the College of Montaigu, where he stayed, was very austere. And while he was there, he continued to be engaged in spiritual conversation and giving of the exercises. And this was his main ministry. And he influenced some important students to leave everything and go begging. One entered a monastery and another went to Jerusalem. So there was great murmuring against him as a troublemaker. And once more, he found himself accused to the Inquisition. It's interesting that during this time, there was he was there at the same time that John Calvin was there, the reformer, the very austere reformer. They weren't at the same college, but they were nearby and roughly at the same time. And one can only wonder whether their paths ever crossed. Did they ever have a conversation? So as we can see, the University of Paris produced many different kinds of people. And it was a place where he really had to mind his P's and Q's, where he really had to step carefully. And so he was always short of funds. He begged on the street. He went to Flanders and even to England to beg for the means to continue his studies. And there were no bursaries then. You had to go begging. And it's interesting. That's fundraising in the 16th century. He wasn't the greatest of students. He was deficient. He was put in with the young boys to catch up. And the problem of spiritual inspirations and consolations during lectures returned, as did his poor health and his chronic stomach pains. Later, he changed colleges. He went to Santa Barbara, and there were many Spanish and Portuguese students there. And where he met most of his first companions, and he formed spiritual comradeship at this point. And the names are familiar: Francis Xavier, Alfonso Salmeron, Diego Lainez, Nicolas Bobadilla. They were all Spanish. Then Peter Faber, who was a Savoyard, and Simão Rodrigues of Portugal. And Peter Faber and Francis Xavier, a nobleman from the eastern end of the Basque Country, were his first roommates. And it's very interesting. At first, Francis Xavier couldn't stand Ignatius and found him austere and rather judgmental and so forth. And later they became the closest of friends. This group of individuals decided at one particular point that they were going to take private vows. And so at Montmartre in Paris, they took private vows of poverty, chastity, and worked for the conversion of infidels and to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The priest there, Peter Faber, was the only one of them who was ordained. So he celebrated the Mass and took their vows. And since the pilgrimage proved impossible due to political and military situation, they placed themselves at the disposal of the Pope, believing that the Pope knew best of all where they could be used. And so this is in 1534. In 1535, Ignatius's health gave out, and the doctor advised him to return to sample his native airs and where he grew up. And he left Paris, and he went through Spain and Bologna and Venice, where he engaged in spiritual exercises with influential people and spiritual conversation. And he and his companions preached, they gave exercises, and worked in hospitals. There was another persecution, rumors and accusations. Cardinal Carafa, who was a real terror, who later became Pope Paul IV, with whom he had many battles. And Ignatius was put on trial on one particular point, and the trial found in favor of Ignatius. Then finally, in 1537, he was ordained to the priesthood in Venice, and as were the others. And they decided to journey together to Jerusalem to convert the Turks. They didn't shrink from taking on a big job. And he had a mystical experience around this time. And during prayer, he saw Christ with the cross on his shoulders, and beside him, the eternal Father, who said, "I wish you to take this man for your servant." And Jesus took him and said, "My will is that you should serve us." Because of war, the passage to Jerusalem was barred, and they decided to go to Rome, offer themselves to the Pope. And on the way, there's a place outside of Rome that you can visit today, La Storta. And there's a small church there. It's at a crossroads. And he was with Lainez and Faber. And Ignatius received a vision of God the Father and Christ holding the cross. That Ignatius stated that the Father had given him to be henceforth consecrated wholly to his service. And Christ spoke the words, "Ego tibi Romae propitius ero." I will be favorable to you in Rome. And he would need that consolation later. He waited an entire year to celebrate his first Mass. And on Christmas Day, 1538, in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, he did so. And I used to live right across the street from that church. His experiences after ordination and during the celebration of Mass were something else. He had the gift of copious tears. He would weep uncontrollably during Mass. And so much so that at one point, the doctor told him, "You have to stop or you're going to go blind." And that plagued him through his entire life. During his visions and during his prayer, he would weep copious tears. And in Rome, there were more accusations and difficulties, and great care had to be taken when dealing with women. And they did put themselves at the disposal of the Pope, and they preached and worked in hospitals. But he and his companions were greeted with suspicion. And there were some persecutions at first. They wanted to hush the whole thing up, but Ignatius insisted that a verdict and a sentence be passed. He was interviewed by the Pope and they were cleared and given permission to continue. And their mission was to preach, instruct children, hear confessions, and give the spiritual exercises. And you note the absence of schools and education. Although the Pope asked two of them, Fathers Diego Lainez and Peter Faber, to teach at the Sapienza in Rome. One of their early apostolates was the Casa Santa Marta, which was a home for prostitutes. And it is still there today, although it is now a police station. They decided to found an order with a rule. And up until this point, they just had a loose association of private vows. And in 1540, they were given approbation by Paul III. And Ignatius was elected the first Father General. And it's at this point, his life took a change. He's no longer the man on the move, that he rarely left the Jesuit Curia. He becomes an administrator. He wrote over 7,000 letters. And they're not just administrative letters. He advised Jesuits to do the same. He was these letters are a permanent witness to life at this particular time. He advised Jesuits to write each other, to Jesuits in the field to write about what they were doing. And these letters, of course, many of them that he wrote were letters to women, giving advice. And there are 2 volumes of them that are translated today, Ignatius's letters to women. And he had the friendship with many women, and most notably Isabel Roser. And Isabel Roser was a great support, and she was also a Jesuit. People often ask me, why don't the Jesuits have women in their order like the others, the Dominicans and the Franciscans and so on? The simple truth of the matter was that we did have 2. And Isabel Roser was one of them. And it didn't last very long. It wasn't a very successful experiment. And Ignatius finally had to dismiss her. She was a noble woman and not used to taking orders, and was mostly used to giving them. And that there was a lot of friction. And at one particular point, he realized that she was resented by many. And so he finally realized that it was not good for her and not good for them. And so she was asked to leave. In 1548, he was questioned again by the Inquisition about the spiritual exercises. As I mentioned, they were not dictated by Our Lady or an angel. They were not even entirely original. There were many similar manuals in Spanish monasteries during the late Middle Ages, and that very similar to the one that Cisneros had introduced him to. And much work of refining and honing is what took place during his years. And that a lot of it was based on his experience. And many of his own struggles are mirrored in the spiritual exercises. There is, of course, a book that, a recent book that was very interesting about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And many of the things that you see in The Lord of the Rings, the monsters, the warfare and so forth, were a reflection of what both of them experienced in the trenches in the First World War. And they were quite explicit when they explained that that was the case. And it's the same with the life of Ignatius, that much of it is reflected in the exercises. And so that you could call it spiritual catharsis, you could call it relating one's experience to the exercises, you could call it many things, but it's definitely there. He could be said to be one who confronted his fears and refused the easy or more comfortable route, as one who trusted totally in God, who pushed back against ego and self-interest, and especially against the love of honor and glory. The motto of the Society of Jesus is Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God, the majesty and sovereignty of God. And so this became an outgrowth of his own particular life, where he related everything that he did to service to the divine majesty. He was one who was consoled by countless mystical visions, along with much emotion and many tears. And he expected people who took the spiritual exercises to have basically the same kinds of experiences. Later on, of course, mysticism received a very bad name, and the spiritual exercises began to calcify. And it has only been in recent years that there's been a great effort to bring them to life again. That they are not ascetical exercises, as so many think. That they are really to dispose one to be docile to the movements of the Spirit and to the communications from God. And that the job of a director during a retreat is not to direct, but to get out of the way and to allow God to communicate directly with the person taking the retreat. And so what kind of man was he? He was a man who would walk the roof of the Jesuit, the house there, the Jesuit, the church, and look at the stars and receive great delight from the stars. He was also one who could find God in all things. He found God in the midst of his own struggle, in the midst of his own pain. He found God in the stars that he looked at. And there's even one particular case that somebody related that as they were sitting at table, he cut open an apple and there was a tiny worm in the apple. And as the worm began to crawl around and so forth, instead of jumping up and throwing it in the garbage and acting upset, he kind of went into a great spiritual and mystical consolation. Why? Because he could see the life of God in this tiny little creature. So he was one who was able to, even in the midst of, as events swirled around him, was able to find God and able to experience God. He died in 1556, probably of malaria fever, and also diagnosed with kidney and bladder stones. This was the cause of the many pains he had over the years. He was beatified in 1609 and canonized in 1622. And going back to this finding God in all things, at the very core of his spirituality is that no activity, human activity, is excluded from Jesuit endeavors, and that God can be found in all of them. And this is why you find Jesuits involved in so many different things. And everything from being a lawyer or a doctor to when I first entered the society, there was a Jesuit in my province who had a tiny little circus that he would carry around the country, complete with a trained bear and horse and a couple of actors. And they would put on little kind of spiritual or morality plays in shopping centers and so forth. And so this is the ability to not exclude any activity from divine endeavors. And another statement written by one of the early Jesuits is that the world is our religious house. And this sounds kind of pale, and but at the time, it was thought that a true religious resided in a house and didn't leave the house except by dire necessity. And so the answer there is the entire world is our religious house. He's given us a couple of things. One is something that is sorely needed in our own time, and that is the ability to discern spirits. Right now, we live in a rather binary world, a black and white world, good and evil, and usually evil consists of people who don't agree with us. But with Ignatius, he always said you have to test the spirits. And it's something that takes great patience and time. And we do something which we do not have. We want instant answers now, but he says, you have to take the time to walk with something, to pray about it, to pay careful attention to your reactions and the movements of the spirits. And you have to, in a sense, you have to work to discern the good from the bad. And so being able to discern is something that we could all learn and all put into practice, because there's precious little of it that goes on today. And finally, the great legacy that he gives us is generosity of heart and spirit. Throughout his life, his overriding concern was the good of souls. And throughout all of his writings, he comes back again and again to that everything has to, every consideration has to consider what is the greatest and more universal good and what is the good for the good of souls. And part of that was his wholehearted ministry to the poor and the desperate. And as we see that sometimes Jesuits have been accused, and probably justly, of being too taken up with serving the rich or the powerful and so on. But at the same time, we look at Ignatius and the early Jesuits at the very beginning of the society, and the beginning of his journey to God. It was the poorest of the poor who were the objects of his works of mercy. That it was always those, the street urchins, teaching them catechism and so forth, working in the hospitals, and getting one's hands dirty. When the great theologian Lainez was at the Council of Trent with a couple of other Jesuits, Ignatius gave them both strict orders that even while they were debating these great theological issues at the council, when they weren't doing that, they were to be catechizing children and working in hospitals. So this is the feet on the ground, hands-on approach that he gives us, to be able to get in and get our hands dirty, and to walk with people, and to, with the words of Pope Francis, to smell like the sheep. And so generosity of heart and spirit. And my friend, getting back to the story at the very beginning, when I asked him to bring me back a picture of Ignatius, he finally found one. And I found it rather jarring because it wasn't what I expected. It was a picture of Ignatius with a solitary tear running down his cheek. And that was so disconcerting to look at, because it's not the image of Ignatius I had. And yet that's the image of Ignatius that existed. The man who could weep, the man who was touched by God, and the man who longed for others to be touched by God too. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Father Scott. And I just want to say that your presentation, it's such a delightful storytelling, and invites us into the life of Ignatius. And I like the little insights and things that draw us into the story. And so we'll now entertain some questions. And so if anybody has a question they'd like to ask, just remember to unmute yourself first, and we'll go from there. Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, Tom.
I'm kind of struck by how late of a bloomer he was, for things to sort of work out for him. He was living a pretty hard life up until, well, probably all of it, but, things didn't really come together for him until, well, he's probably close to 50 years old. And I'm wondering, how all those experiences, how do you think those early experiences sort of influenced him when he finally did become the first sort of administrator of the Society of Jesus?
Well, it's a good question, because I've often wondered, and people didn't live all that long then either, and that he was a late bloomer. He probably wouldn't even be admitted to the society today, because the way it's. You have to take all kinds of factors into consideration. But he, I think one of the things that it probably did was convince him of God's mercy. And there's a place in the exercises where it's a meditation on hell, and that's where repels a lot of people. It's a very graphic meditation on hell. Smell the sulfur, hear the screams, all that sort of thing. It looks like some kind of cheap movie or something. But that's what he expects. But when he gets there, he discovers that that's not what is in store for him. That he realizes that God and the saints and all of the stars in the entire universe has been working on his behalf, and that there's this great mercy. And then finally, in that final meditation, it's a meditation to obtain divine love. And it's a meditation where the love of God just comes cascading down and flowing through him and flowing through all of creation. And I think that's the really kind of has the was the outgrowth of all of his his struggles. And I mean, I mentioned to Manresa, I mean, the guy was a candidate for a psych ward at that particular point because he was a mess, but he stuck with it. There wasn't any choice then, and he had people at proper times who helped him and so forth. But it was God's mercy and God's grace that got him through all of that. So I think he trusting in God's grace and realizing that all things were possible with God was the outgrowth of that.
Father Scott, I was wondering, is there much written about his connections with family and maybe even the military in his later years, sort of after his injury? Was there kind of some of that, or did he really kind of just have sort of new connections after that?
Well, he didn't really get along all that well with all of his family members. And at one particular point, he wrote some kind of legal document naming his brother and saying, calling him my brother according to the flesh, and I no longer have any responsibility for him, and basically washing his hands of him. So all was not well, and I guess it was kind of a dysfunctional family. And as far as the military, it wasn't military like we have today. It was more in the service of the local lord and so forth. And so it wasn't a standing army. So he pretty much walked away from all of that. Although a few of the early Jesuits were chaplains for different military forces. But it seemed like he just had a complete, and he walked, after becoming general of the Society of Jesus, it was another walking away. He walked away from that kind of active apostolic life that he had and retreated behind the walls of the Jesuit curia and rarely came out, except when he had to. So it's interesting. When he was finished with something, he was finished with something and had the ability just to kind of walk onto something else.
Father Scott, yeah, Jim Pancho from King's in London, Ontario. So listen, I was very pleased to be invited for the lecture, and I'm happy to hear you. One of the things that intrigued me and is the sense that Ignatius was a man of his context. He was a man of his time, and I guess I'm trying to. One of the things I'm listening for is what does Ignatius have to say to us, or maybe it's how is his spirituality forming us within our context today? How do we listen in the midst of everything that's around us in Canada and in Catholic education and whatnot? I'm kind of drawing on your role as a university administrator as well, maybe in that, if you want to comment, or if that's beyond the scope of what we're doing. It just I'm just keenly aware of that we're in a different world, and yet a lot of the same themes keep emerging. So maybe that's a starting place for a few comments.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was very important for Ignatius was the Incarnation. And in the spiritual exercises, he focuses, in my mind, rather an inordinate amount of time on the scene in the stable in Bethlehem, and and has the retreatant spend all kinds of time there, using the imagination and recreating the scene and smelling the straw and things like that, and to be a servant there, helping Mary and Joseph, and then he says to savor the divinity, the sweetness of the divinity. And this is part of the medieval interior senses and so forth, but really believing that the human and the material and the spiritual and divine had come together. And that kind of forms the basis of a lot of his spirituality, that the world belongs to God. And he does not shrink from any kind of service to God in that world. And I think this is really something that we need to know, is that is that God is present here, and that our job is here, and that service can take many different forms, but it always has to be in the service of people, in the service of souls. And I think that this kind of willingness to enter into the incarnation and enter into human life and to walk with people, I think is probably one of his biggest contributions.
Father Scott, what do you think? Just wondering a couple of things. One, what do you think is sort of a great resource today for somebody interested in taking a look at, like, the practice of discernment or tools for discernment? If there's something you think is kind of a good resource, and or a particular kind of like creative use of the exercises or some of the sort of Ignatian tools today.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. There's used to be called the 19th annotation. Now it's just called the retreat in everyday life. And it's kind of the spiritual exercises light, where people can not go away to a retreat house, but continue with their work and their jobs and so forth, but set aside a certain amount of time every day for prayer and meditation, and to kind of walk through the spiritual exercises over a period of several months. That's one particular way that, and many people are finding that is helping them get through a lot of things, including a lot of the stresses that come, during our own time with COVID and things like that, is that we need a spiritual anchor, and we need kind of a structure that brings God present to us in the struggles of our everyday life. And that's a very good one for kind of answering questions and learning a little bit. The book by James Martin, I always forget the title. It's what you always wanted to know about Jesuits or whatever. The Jesuit answer to everything, or I can't remember the exact title, but basically it's a kind of a crash course in Jesuit terminology and Jesuit ideas and so forth, and written with a good degree of humor and so forth. And I'd say that's a good introduction for someone who's completely unacquainted with things. Those are two things. And there's also let's see, the third part of that question was about the resources for retreats, or for
I think like resources for retreats, but maybe for learning about discernment, or that.
Discernment, yeah, discernment. And there's some popular books out, and I can't think of any exact titles right now, but there's a number of them. And I'd say that discernment is something, it's one of those terms that gets batted around a lot, and you have to be really careful how you use it and so forth, because sometimes people will tell you what your discernment is supposed to be, and that's not discernment at all. And a good part of discernment is you have to leave everything behind and let God tell you what the scoop is. So I think there's the book mentions somebody, Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything by James Martin, and nice catchy title. And it would give you an introduction to some of those concepts and so forth. There are some books out on, there's one by Timothy Gallagher, who's not a Jesuit, who belongs to a different order, and he's written a book on discernment too. And so that would be another possibility. Yes, sorry, Sammy.
Hello, hi. I thought to ask this question as you were speaking. I mean, I know the life of St. Ignatius as well, but something struck me as you were speaking is the two sides of Ignatius. The pragmatic side, the man of practical things, but also the mystical side. Yeah. So can you say a little bit more how he embodied both, and like how they fed on each other in his personality, especially after his conversion, given that we are celebrating his conversion?
It's a good question, because he struggled with it and he didn't always handle it very well, like especially when he tried to study. It was in class. And you would almost wonder if the mystical experiences were an escape from a boring lecture. And I've never had my students have mystical experiences. Usually they read their email, but having these particular experiences in the midst of everything, he says, how do I handle this? How can I do both? And his solution was just to kind of will the mystical experiences away or kind of keep them at bay. And I'm not sure that that was necessarily the best approach. One of the hallmarks of Jesuit spirituality is becoming a contemplative inaction. And it doesn't mean somebody who is involved in activity but has their eyes rolled upwards like one of those pious pictures or whatever, and their head in the clouds. It means somebody who's very aware of God's presence in everything that they do. And I think that as time went on, and he was more focused on ministry and forming the Society of Jesus and so forth, I think it became easier for him to do. It was harder when he was in the earlier stages of his formation, when first of all, he was bored silly. And secondly, he really felt that he knew more than a lot of what the official line was, and that he was more sure of it because of the way it had come to him. And so I think that as time went on and he became more integrated into who he was as a priest and as a spiritual director and so on, I think it became more integrated into his personality. But it was always something that there was a tension between the two, and there always is. It is said, and I think with some justice, that there are two ways that Jesuits kind of fall off the tightrope. And being a contemplative inaction is like a tightrope. And you can either fall off in one direction and become the guy who never leaves the chapel. And in the early Jesuits, it was some of his men wanted to run off and become Carthusians, hermits. And that was, they called the Carthusian monastery in Spain the flame that attracts our moths. And so many of them wanted to just kind of leave this world. The other extreme and the other direction that many fall is just activism, being excessively busy. And I think that affects most of us, where we can become just kind of excessively busy workaholics and so forth. And, oh, but I'm doing it all for God. Well, yes and no. I mean, it's we are, but there's also something to be lost in that too, where you can really lose a sense of the presence of God in what you're doing. It's not you're doing this for God, but God is actually present. And I think that's always the tension in Jesuit spirituality. And I'm not sure that he completely reconciled all that in his own lifetime.
I take consolation, if I may say so, as I reflect on Ignatius being the administrator, given
yeah, right. Yeah. Have you written 7,000 letters? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one or two more questions, if there are any. Wonderful. Okay, well, we'll take that as our call to conclude. And so really such a wonderful topic, and more to be said. And so down the road, we'll certainly have some offerings to come and provide those in a way that people can access live and after the fact. I know there are a number of folks that are going to be watching this later, and so we're excited to have you along as well. So thanks for joining, everybody, and have a great evening. Father Scott, thanks again for sharing with us and for making it a delightful story that we can enter into and kind of work with a little bit in our own experiences.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.